Two men, one country, and the world watching. Hundreds of people have been killed and thousands forced to flee their homes after several weeks of fighting in Sudan. The conflict stems from a power struggle between Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the de facto leader of Sudan and the head of the Sudanese armed forces, and Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemedti, the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, who have been accused of crimes against humanity during the war in Darfur in 2014 and 2015. This bloody conflict is the latest in a series of battles in Sudan since its independence in 1956, but this one has garnered a lot of international attention, with countries scrambling to evacuate their citizens. Furthermore, many countries, including the US, view Sudan as important due to its natural resources and its influence in the Horn of Africa, and have asked for tensions to de-escalate. Many have called for the US and other Western forces to intervene, but Washington is reluctant to do so, due to a mixture of failed interventions in Iraq and Libya this century, as well as the efforts towards Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia also has a part to play, as it has a deal with Hemedti over his seized gold, whilst the RSF have denied reports that it is being funded by the Wagner Group. So, is the US reluctant to intervene over fears it could lead to a proxy war with Russia? Should the West be worried about whether Sudan falls into the wrong hands, or should it stay out of Sudan's business? Is there any cause for optimism among the Sudanese people? Should the West intervene in Sudan?
So let's get to it, gentlemen. Should the West intervene in Sudan? As always, we begin with our quick fire round. 30 seconds each will out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick it up from there. So, Usumain Baraka, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Thank you. The Western countries, they can intervention in Sudan in different ways. What I say. One is that the countries, they can send humanitarian aid to IDP camps in Sudan and Darfur or around the country, and then also send to refugee camps. And also, the second thing is that also to send or to put sanctions on Sudanese officials.
So there are different types of intervention. We will unpack it further in a second. We will just conclude our first round. Hussain Abdul-Hussain, your thoughts?
The West should absolutely intervene in Sudan. Intervention doesn't have to be military, shouldn't be military. The West has a huge toolbox in which to intervene diplomatically, economically, offer humanitarian aid, try to find leverage to convince the combating parties to seek a truce, stop the fighting, and push toward peace.
Yes, again, the different types of intervention. Last but not least, Michael Tracey, your thoughts?
Well, whatever hesitation there might be in the U.S. to intervene in Sudan can't be born of an aversion to engage in a proxy war with Russia. That's obviously already going on full bore in Ukraine. It's interesting because I was in Washington, D.C. last week, and there was a man who made a reasonable point to me. He was Sudanese himself. He was clamoring for greater U.S. intervention in the country to bring a cessation to the violence. And he said, Ukraine is calling for all these weapons, these tanks, these missile systems, and so forth. We just want humanitarian aid, and yet there's no significant constituency for providing that. And he wondered about that discrepancy, and I thought it was a fair point.
Yeah, the priorities or hypocrisy when it comes to global conflicts. On that note, gentlemen, let's please feel free to interact. And Michael Tracey, we will dive in further into the Russian angle, if you will, later on in the conversation. But Usumain, I do want to begin with you. Will the war in Sudan stay in Sudan?
Say again the question again?
Whether the war in Sudan remains only local, only in Sudan?
Well, people in Sudan now, the local people trying to go to different countries and to becoming refugees, a border between Chad and Sudan. So a lot of refugees from Sudan going to Chad area, and also go to a border to Ethiopia and also Eritrea and also South Sudan. A lot of people trying to get out of the country because the situation became very difficult, and people even didn't get any help from other international organizations. So now the situation all over the country became very tough. It's just 4 days, last 4 days, just in city Jenin, hundreds of people killed by militias of Sudan government we call Janjaweed, and just killing people, civilians, and the civilians they trying to even to get out and get some help, and they didn't find any help. And now a lot of people in Sudan who is not citizen of Sudan, even they want to also try to get out of Sudan. Also that's for them also it's became very difficult situation right now. We can see in our fast because Juba peace agreement 2020, before that agreement, a lot of also UN forces, they were in Darfur area, and after they are left after Juba peace agreement, and that's the situation became more worse all Darfur area, and the people dying every day. So that was kind of wrong decision. That's like UN forces to leave the situation in Darfur area.
And to that point, Mr. Abdul-Hussain, is it in the power, or should it be in the power of foreign actors to prevent local conflicts such as this one?
It's not only a prerogative, it's in the interest of Western powers. No one wants to see a failed state. I don't think the fighting in Sudan will be contagious. It'll remain in Sudan. But there will be a spillover in terms of if when Sudan becomes a failed state, you will risk having terrorism, narcotics, piracy in the Red Sea. All these problems will threaten countries of the region and countries of the world eventually. And that's why the West has an intrinsic interest in getting to some sort of peace, in having someone who manages Sudan, preventing a failed state. This does not mean that the West needs to deploy its military force, because it's really absurd to be engaged in a civil war where everyone is just fighting everyone and you don't know who's friend and who's foe. But has a lot of instruments through which to try to get Sudan, try to go the leaders, the two fighting generals, to convince them that they have to stop. I'm not sure whether they can. I think at this point the war looks endless. It looks pointless, and I'm not sure unless we get to unless the two parties are tired enough to stop fighting, just like what happened in Yemen. Everyone tried to stop the fighting, and it went on for years. It even went out of the news cycle, and then when everyone felt tired, they just stopped fighting. So my fear is that this is what will happen in Sudan, with no one who has actual leverage to force these parties to stop fighting.
And speaking to that point, Michael Tracey, broadly speaking, is foreign intervention easing or deepening local conflicts? And as a follow-up question, if you will, maybe, or should rather, regional actors spearhead intervention, in our case, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, and not the U.S. or Russia, for that matters?
Well, one of the problems with calls for intervention on humanitarian grounds is that, at least in the case of the U.S., it's often a pretext for the U.S. to achieve other geopolitical prerogatives. So, for example, in 2019, there were calls and clamors for humanitarian intervention of a sort in Venezuela. And the Trump administration claimed that it was going to be provisioning convoys of medical aid and food supplies and so forth into the country. And they freely admitted not long afterward that it was essentially a regime change operation. Similar pretexts have been cited around U.S. interventionist policies in Syria and even in Ukraine pre-2022 invasion. So I do think it's worthwhile to be wary of the ultimate ambition of some of these policy proposals. And I would just ask the gentleman from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which agitates for intervention all over the world all the time, so that's nothing new. But I'm wondering, like, what specifically is he calling for the U.S. to do in Sudan that it's not already doing? If you're talking about just brokering a ceasefire, the U.S. at least purports to have already been involved in doing so as of last week and actually brought about a cessation of the warfare in Sudan, unlike in Ukraine where it works against a ceasefire. So it's interesting to see how quickly the U.S. can obtain a ceasefire when it actually wants to cease the fighting. But beyond that, what is he so desperate for the U.S. to do exactly?
Hussain Abdul-Hussain, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm happy that I got to break his stereotype that we're agitating for intervention, because I clearly said I do not support military intervention. So military intervention is one of the tools in the foreign policy box, but it does not work everywhere. And in the case of Sudan, it absolutely does not work. The U.S. understand that we don't have enough leverage in Sudan, but we have to do the utmost that we can to get to peace, to make the fighting stop. The U.S. doesn't really have, unlike what Russian propaganda and other propaganda says, doesn't have actual vested or hidden interests in Sudan, not after the resources, not after basing rights in Sudan. The U.S. already uses bases in Egypt. And there's no need for a port to the Red Sea. So all these demands have been voiced by Russia to Sudanese leaders. The U.S. has helped to zero debt, has helped to reconnect Sudan after the change of the regime of al-Bashir, has been trying to help push Sudan in a positive direction. I don't think a military intervention is warranted at this point. I don't think that the West has a magic wand with which it can end the fighting and make everything right and disappear. But the West has a clear responsibility to help in terms of humanitarian aid, to help in terms of getting everyone to be reasonable and to stop the fighting in the best interest of the Sudanese and everyone in the region.
I'm not sure I heard him call for a single specific measure. I mean, I think earlier he referenced sanctions. That's always the tool in the toolkit that's instinctively deployed by the U.S. Economic warfare the world over, irrespective of how effective that policy tends to be, which is usually not very. But other than that, I didn't hear him call for anything.
Michael, just before we wrap up the first part of our conversation, now let's allow Usumain to chime in.
Yeah, I do believe that, the Western countries, they have to be involved by anyways to do how to even protect the civilians, because they have to bring the forces, army forces, even to just for the goal will be just to keep to the civilians be safely, because there's if no forces, that will be very difficult situation in Sudan. So they have to involve what's going on in Sudan.
Okay, obviously, gentlemen, we have much more to unpack. So you're staying with us, Hussain Abdul-Hussain, Michael Tracey, and Usumain Baraka. We're taking a short break, but when we get back, we focus on the Russian standpoint here, or more specifically, the Wagner Group. Don't go anywhere. A few minutes, and we're back with the summit. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Michael Tracey, Hussain Abdul-Hussain, and Usumain Baraka. Thank you so very much, gentlemen, for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to the conversation, the Wagner Group involvement in Sudan. Will Russia be eating the cake and having it too, to an extent? Let's take a listen to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov today.
Concerning Wagner Group, this is a private military company. We've repeatedly touched upon the issue, including in this room. A few years ago, our French colleagues and the head of diplomacy in the European Union, Josep Borrell, issued grievances towards our links to Mali and the Central African Republic. And they created some kind of mini-scandal with respect to the fact that the government of Mali, under circumstances when the French began to withdraw their operations from the country and began to close their military bases in the north, where the main terrorist threat remained. And in this situation, the government of Mali, in order not to be left without defense, turned to the services of the private military company, the Wagner Group. Central African Republic, Mali, and Sudan, as well as a number of other countries, whose governments, whose legitimate authorities turn to these kinds of services, have the right to do so.
Okay, gentlemen, another quick fire round, 30 seconds each, and we take it from there. Should Russia intervene in Sudan? Simply put, Hussain Abdul-Hussain, please take the lead.
I don't think Russia should intervene, only because Russia doesn't have the same goals of bringing peace. Russia has its own interest. Most of the time, we will see trafficking of illicit trade increase on the Russian watch. So I'd rather not see the Russians just multiply whatever they're doing in other countries, including in Russia.
Michael Tracey, your take?
But hold on a second. I'm not in the business personally of advocating for any country to intervene anywhere for the most part, but why ought not Russia intervene if it's going to bring about the alleviation of humanitarian suffering that it's claimed needs to be carried out because they have other geopolitical imperatives? Well, gee whiz, does that mean the United States might as well have other geopolitical imperatives that could be separate from just this pure-hearted humanitarianism? I don't know. It's a theory worth pondering.
Usumain, does it matter why? What's the motivation?
Russia.
Yeah.
Russia already involved in Sudan. Russia is sending and supporting the malicious groups, and they are in Sudan we call Janjaweed, and they are Hamdan for Hamiti groups, and they are until they are they are destroying, they are killing civilians, so they are supporting already many years. So Russia's totally decide the side and support to who.
Okay, gentlemen, let's please feel free to interact on this from this point onwards. I do want to circle back to what Sergei Lavrov just said. On a more fundamental level, should governments have the right to turn to foreign paramilitary groups? Hussain Abdul-Hussain?
Well, in principle, they can. The only issue is that whatever group commits any kind of combat, this group has to be under the authority of a known government. If a group is not under the authority of a government, then it becomes a terrorist group. I think this question that the Russian foreign minister did not answer. So he did not say whether this group was actually under Russian supervision and authority, or whether who pays this group, who gives orders to these groups. If it's an independent group, then we have a problem. If Russia is behind the group, then fine. Let them just say this is one of the groups that serves the interests of the Russian Federation.
Michael,
can I ask the think tank representative here, who is, as usual, a representative of huge amounts of military-industrial interest in Washington, D.C., whatever his own personal views, that's the institution he belongs to. So I'm just curious. Let's say the Russian state or the Wagner Group or whomever does have foul motives in its rationale for why it might intervene in Sudan, but nonetheless, it would bring about an alleviation of humanitarian suffering, whether by providing food or medicine or what have you. You'd still oppose that because of the foul motive? Why? Well, is it because that your chief concern isn't actually the alleviation of human suffering, but rather it's the propagation of certain geopolitical interests? Because if Russia would expand its influence by engaging in these humanitarian actions in Sudan, so what? If your sole priority is to make it so that people aren't suffering as much as they are now, then that shouldn't matter to you, right?
Mr. Abdul-Hussain, yeah?
Sure, yes. Well, I find it really ironic that the gentleman who is not Arab, who's sitting in New York, is lecturing the two of us who are Arab, one of us who's from Sudan. And the gentleman from Sudan clearly stated that he'd rather have the West intervene for humanitarian support, and that he perceives a Russian intervention as destructive. So if you have someone from Sudan,
he changed the subject.
No, hold on.
Gentlemen, Michael, let's allow Mr. Abdul-Hussain.
Michael,
that's amazing.
Michael, I'm going along the same lines that you're trying to use. You are a colonial person sitting in New York giving instructions to people of the region who know the region. You can't even read a Sudanese newspaper, whereas we can. So I advise you to
blame the host of the show. They invited me on to talk to you. I'm not affiliated with a think tank like you.
Gentlemen, yes. Let's please try to.
Excuse me, ma'am. Am I crazy, or did I hear him try to impugn me on the basis of me being white?
No,
did I hear that correctly?
Again, we got a bit too heated at this point of the debate.
Well, that wasn't a function of what I said. That was what he said. He said I'm not Arab, therefore I have no right to comment. Then why did you invite me on the show?
No, we invite all three of you on the show because we find it important to listen to all different views.
I've heard a lot of pathetic rhetoric from think tank operatives in my life, but
I'm having an issue. I'm having an issue with Michael. He's putting words in my mouth all the time. First, he said that I was for intervention, which I was not. Second, he said I said that he does not have the right to express his opinion, which he's doing, and which I'm debating with goodwill. I said you're Arab. It means you don't understand the story as much as from someone from Sudan itself.
Impugning of me on the basis of my identity characteristics. What is wrong with you?
It has nothing. It has nothing to do with your identity.
Michael, I'm trying to understand.
Gentlemen,
think tank operatives over the years, but this is among the most despicable.
Okay, obviously some lack of a proper understanding of one another here. Our goal.
I understood him perfectly.
Okay, let's try to take a deep breath and go back to the topic of discussion. My apologies if I mishandled or did not mediate the conversation properly.
I would never dream of commenting on your racial characteristics, sir. Notwithstanding your lack of funding from defense
Michael,
Usumain Baraka, please chime in here. Let's try to get back on topic. Are there any prospects for returning to a democratic transition in Sudan at this point in time? Is the international community strong enough to foster peace at this day and age?
Well, first of all, there's no hope to see the peace in Sudan. So, as I mentioned, Russia and other countries, they are supporting to Janjaweed groups and militias, and they are continue and they killing civilians. So there is no hope to see any peace in Sudan or even democracy in Sudan. Like coming couple years, even we don't see that. So in this case, we have to let's say we have to give the awareness to Western countries. They have to involve and they have to even to find any ways how to bring even the military force in Sudan and try to find the people who is killing the civilians and to make a better situation in Sudan, because we are as Sudanese, we really need the government of Sudan will be democracy and not dictatorship as was until today.
Okay, gentlemen, on that note, we must conclude our conversation.